All right, welcome back. Going to be doing something a little bit differently. Um, I found this video that I had never known before. Dr. Jordan B. Cooper's 5 Reasons Why He's Not Eastern Orthodox. And had to read through it, had to watch through it, and I thought that I'd make kind of a response to it. I noticed in the comments are just a disaster. Really not anything all that either intelligent or cordial. Um, Emil made an interesting response. I'm going to be talking about his comment. Actually, I'm going to be leaning on his comment a lot for justification, point 3. So Dr. Jordan B. Cooper and I have interacted basically only once. I remember a year ago now when Jay Dyer was talking about debating him, and Dr. Cooper said no, and of course, the typical tactics of, oh, soy boy, and whatever. That was my first interaction with him, and that we don't really talk at all. Though I do follow him on Twitter. So I was intrigued by his video. I was Lutheran. I grew up, unfortunately, ELCA, but the rest of my family, all my cousins and aunts and uncles and whatnot, they're Missouri. Um, so not totally out there. When I watched through his video, I was often, sad to say, banging my head trying to figure out how he could conclude some of these things. So I'm just going to walk through the video here in a moment. I do also just want to say, Dr. Jordan B. Cooper, you can see right here, I am a huge Clone Wars fan. I think it's a fantastic series. Star Wars is a really great concept, and I tend to watch it quite frequently. Anyway, let's just start the video, and we'll see kind of where we go here.
There's by far one video that I've been requested more than any other video, and that is 5 reasons why I'm not Eastern Orthodox. Now, I haven't done this yet for a particular reason, well, a couple of reasons, I guess. One is it's kind of hard to do it because Eastern Orthodoxy does not have a strict catechism or something like what we have in the Roman Catholic Church or anything like the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Reformed tradition. So nearly anything I say in discussion or debate with Eastern Orthodoxy, it's always going to be brought up that they don't have an explicit statement about that issue. So it does become a little more difficult when we're interacting. The second reason is just that a lot of people who I've talked to are considering becoming Eastern Orthodox, and they've asked me to do this video. And honestly, a short video on YouTube about the reasons why I'm not Eastern Orthodox is not going to convince you not to become Eastern Orthodox. I've done podcasts on the issue dealing with converts to Eastern Orthodoxy from Lutheranism, and I've written a book, Christification, on the topic of theosis. So if you want to really get in depth, I do have some resources that are going to be more in depth in this video, but since you have all been asking for it, I will give my personal 5 reasons why I am not Eastern Orthodox. So the first reason is the apophatic way of doing theology. Now, the apophatic way of doing theology begins with Pseudo-Dionysius and then develops throughout the Eastern tradition specifically. But apophatic theology essentially is this. It says that the way that we know God is by discerning what he is not, rather than by positive propositions about his own nature.
All right, let's stop right here. This is already disturbing. So, yes, is apophaticism by negation? Well, of course. But apophaticism is not just negation. That's the problem. That's the problem that we're facing here, right? So, for those who have watched The Ground, Father Justinian and I did a 2-part series on apophaticism. We could have made it much more. It's an extremely dense topic. But apophaticism is negation, but it's also 2 other things. It's primarily 3 things, okay? So the second thing is hyperabundance, okay? And the third thing is laconicism, okay? So what is hyperabundance? Hyperabundance is like omniscience, omnipresence, omnipotence, right? So a superabundance of presence, a superabundance of power, a superabundance of knowledge. not in that order. Um, it's interesting. He brings up Saint Dionysius. Dionysius talks about this, about the divine gloom, right? That the hyperabundance of light leads to darkness that leads to its inverse. And we actually see this in created nature, right? If we were to all stare at the sun, we would have such a hyperabundance of light that we would go blind and it would become darkness. Okay. So already, his point about apophaticism being about negation and this being a big reason why he is disinterested in Orthodox theology. Let me phrase it this way: why he thinks Orthodox theology is not on the mark, right? How it might be lacking in some sense. His whole idea of apophaticism just does not even touch what it is that orthodoxy is. It's a caricature. It's saying it's only negation. It's just simply not, right? The third thing, laconicism, right? So being laconic, right? This has two further subsets, right? So we are laconic in two ways. One is not talking about things that we do not know. Okay. And the second is not talking too much about things that we do know. Okay. So we try to be efficient in our speech, not simply for efficiency's sake, but in that we don't want to be vainly babbling. I mean, that's right from the scriptures, right? So we have to include these other two concepts of apophaticism when addressing what Eastern Orthodox theology is going to be is trying to teach us.
Or who he is. And so we know God by way of negation, because human language is always limited and God's essence is unknowable. So the way we get closer to God and knowledge of God is by negating all human language and ways of speaking about God. And this plays into Eastern Orthodox spirituality in many ways. It is a large part of hesychasm. It's often the case that the kind of height of prayer is to have this wordless, even thoughtless prayer, and just being still in God's unknowability. And my problem with apophaticism isn't that it is just that it's inherently wrong to say God's essence is unknowable. Of course, God is transcendent. But in the Western tradition, God is known more by way of analogy. And this is something that St. Thomas Aquinas develops very, very thoroughly, is to say that we know God, he communicates himself to us through means of analogy. In other words, he speaks to us in ways that we understand, and we understand him in the way that we would understand an analogy. So God speaks to us as good, he is loving, things like that.
Right. So again, it's hard to believe that he says he's read divine names. Saint Dionysius is very clear in divine names that we name God off of the created effects, right? So he brings up analogy. We see something is good, and we can say, well, God is the goodness of that thing. We see that something is beautiful, God would be the beauty of that thing, right? Or would be the source of the beauty of that thing. And this is going to come in. I think his next segment here is on how Orthodox theology is too Neoplatonic. But we have to remember that the source of all of these things is beyond those things, right? So if we remember our Proclus, we remember propositions 1 through 6. I think it's right at the beginning that the source has to be, the principle of the thing has to be anterior to the thing that you're talking about. So this is why the apophaticism is so important, because yes, is an orthodoxy cataphatic? Absolutely. I mean, all we have to do is go to any of the services to listen to what we are singing at the Kleros, to what we're saying in the Menaion, right? But we have to also realize that God is beyond, as source, right? God as source is beyond those things, and the big issue between Palamos, Saint Gregory Palamos, and Barlaam is: do we only ever participate in these created analogies, or do we actually participate directly with God? That is the fundamental question, right? So to say, oh, we know God primarily through analogy, and that's not direct apprehension. And we're gonna come to this later. regarding John 17:21 later in the video, but I just the already again major confusion.
There is an analogy between our love, our goodness, and that which belongs to God. So we understand Him through those analogies, even though they're not definitive of God's essence, at least not in the way that we understand them. And that has to do with the relationship between attributes of this world and God's attributes. So that kind of leads us to a whole other discussion. But I would also point to that largely in
Right, talking about our attributes and God's attributes, kind of equating the two almost. I mean, I hope Dr. Cooper is not doing that. That would make God a creature. But again, I mean, even talk his whole idea of how we know God through analogy, and our love is like God's love, or God's love is transcendent of our love. Well, that's apophaticism, right? So this is almost self-contradictory. Let's continue.
And primarily that the New Testament itself just points us, when it's speaking about our relationship to God, it points us to the person and work of Christ. And that's not to say that the Eastern Orthodox don't point to the person and work of Christ at all, but what I find is in kind of apophatic spirituality, there really is not enough emphasis where the New Testament places its emphasis. And where the New Testament places its emphasis is actually on the person and work of Christ. And if we want to...
Yeah, amen. Yeah, we do put emphasis on the person and work of Christ. The issue is that the person and works that he does, the person who he is and the works that he does are beyond our comprehension, right? So at the end of the Gospel of John, St. John is very clear that if all the works and all the things that he had done were to be written down, not all the books can contain them, right? So we have this kind of tunnel vision view that we know absolutely everything about Jesus. No, Jesus is God. And God invites us, Jesus invites us into a paternal son relationship. This is John 1:12, right? That he gives us power to become sons of God. And in John 17:21, he says that he gives the glory that the Father gave him, he's going to give that glory to the apostles. That glory is not created. That glory is not created. That is an uncreated glory. Or rather, it is the uncreated glory, right? And he gives that directly to the apostles. So, of course, we have to, at some point, abandon cataphaticism. On top of this, again, coming back to Dionysius, I don't know if he's actually read him. So, mystical theology. I'm going to jump over here. Mystical theology. This is on section 2. I think it's section 2 of chapter 2. But see that none of the uninitiated listen to the things, those I mean who are entangled in things being, and fancy there is nothing super essentially above things being. This comes back to what we're talking about. But imagine that they know by their own knowledge him who has placed darkness as his hiding place. But if the divine initiations are above such, what would anyone say respecting those still more uninitiated, such as both portray the cause exalted above all from the lowest of things created, and say that it in no wise excels the no gods fashioned by themselves and of manifold shapes, it being our duty both to attribute and to affirm all the attributes of things existing to it as the cause of all. Again, we talked about that already. As since he is the source, we can attribute these things to him as the source. And more properly, to deny them all of it, right? To deny all the attributes of him as being above all. This is the important point. And not to consider the negations to be in opposition to the affirmations, but far rather that it, which is above every abstraction and definition, is above the privations. So apophaticism and cataphaticism are not in opposition to each other. This is a complete misunderstanding of not only Orthodox theology and what it is that St. Dionysius is saying, to the point where I just simply don't believe he's actually read St. Dionysius. It's actually misunderstanding the relationship, just the mundane relationship between apophaticism and cataphaticism, right? Just yeah.
To know who
Let's
God
continue.
is, we look at where God has revealed himself, and that is in the person of Christ. And so when we're speaking about how do we know God, Luther would point to Jesus, even the infant in the manger, saying, "What you need to know what God is like, look at that baby Jesus in the manger."
Right. I think on the Incarnation by St. Athanasius is probably a pretty good place to start. I'm positive he's read it. On top of this, we do look at Christ, right, as being the healer of our nature, as being the restoration of our nature. This is going to come into play in another, probably in the next segment. Maybe I should just let it keep rolling.
So, in terms of how we explain God and how we generally approach theology, there's going to be a major difference. So, that's the first reason that I'm giving. And the second reason I'm not Eastern Orthodox is the way that they express theosis. Now, this is the reason a lot of people ask me about this, because I'm a proponent of the doctrine of theosis. I've written a book on it. I've explained it in podcasts and videos and in different places. I think it's something that's very clearly in the Church Fathers. It's something that Scripture itself talks about. We are partakers of the divine nature. We really can't avoid that kind of language. But the way that theosis is expressed, especially in the Paulinite tradition in Eastern Orthodoxy, is something that I don't necessarily agree with. I think that the experiential way of looking at theosis in terms of a particular kind of experience draws largely from Neoplatonism more so than it does the text of Scripture itself. And so that's through the lens of Pseudo-Dionysius, Maximus Confessor, and others. And you'll look at someone like Vladimir Lossky and the way that he expresses these views. And this is something you find in some Eastern Orthodox articles even as well. Those who are scholars of theosis have often posited, and you can look at my book Christification where I cover this, but they've often posited that there are basically two different modes of looking at theosis. And there is one that is more redemptive historical in its core, and this is the one that you find in people like St. Irenaeus, where you have this emphasis on Jesus' incarnation as redemptive. And in his incarnation, we participate through him in these attributes that belong to God himself.
Okay, great. Let's pause it right here. Yeah, I mean, I really don't think he's read Dionysius at all. The first four names, the divine names, are good, light, beauty, and love. Okay, and they every name is in a hierarchy. Okay, so goodness is at the top, and it unfolds. Excuse me. Everything is very clear. Saint Dionysius is very clear that it's an unfolding of the good. Saint Gregory Palamas talks about this. Saint Maximus talks about this because they're drawing from Saint Dionysius. So good unfolds and creates light. Not creates light, but is an unfolding into the light, is an unfolding then into beauty, is an unfolding then into love, and then is an unfolding into the fifth name, which is being, and everything else unfolds after that because everything else is being after that, some form of being. So, what are these names? Right. So good. Right. Saint Gregory Palamas calls the essence goodness. So God is not just good, but He is goodness. This is an important point. Okay, unfolds into light, and light is the thing which allows us to know all of things, right? Like light, the light of knowledge, understanding, the dispelling of ignorance, right? We get that even from the creation account in Genesis 1. We can look at Saint Athanasius of Sinai. I'm sorry, Saint Anastasius of Sinai, the spiritual child of Saint Maximus. You can read his Hexameron, fantastic work. Where he talks about light in this way regarding Genesis 1. Then we get to beauty. Okay, so what is beautiful? Beautiful is the ordering of all things. Beauty is the logos, right? Because the logos makes all things beautiful by ordering them in the way that they are supposed to be ordered. Okay, and so what is love? Well, if we make a loose analogy of good beauty, of good as Father and beauty as Son, what would love be? Love would be the Spirit. And love would be the redemptive for, bringing back things into beauty, bringing things back into their telos, into what they are supposed to be, right? The way that God ordered them to be, the way that the Logos tells them to be, right? The way that they are meant to be. And we see this in Ambiguous 7, right? When discussing the idea of the logi, St. Maximus is talking about, God as our telos or telos, as the fulfillment, as the redemptive process. That's kind of so this idea that we're just mentally coming up with these things and ignoring this redemption is not true on that angle. It's also not true just based on what the services say. There was not a single canon that I have read, and the canons are read at matins, right? So every liturgy we have the matin service right before, whether it's at vigil the night before in the Russian or immediately preceding uh, in the Greek rite. And there was not a single canon that does not say Jesus came to restore human nature. Jesus came to heal human nature. Jesus came to elevate human nature. Jesus came to save human nature. Just go to the services. So, I mean, I'm sorry, Dr. Cooper, but your concept of Eastern Orthodoxy is utterly lacking. I think maybe you read the single book by Losky, and then or maybe some other secondary material. But this caricature is almost offensive. It's obvious you don't know at all what we are talking about.
Immortality and incorruptibility are the two that show up the most. And this is the way that it's expressed in St. Athanasius. And so we have a divide then between that and Pseudo-Dionysius. And the Eastern tradition has drawn from both to different degrees, and it depends on who the figure is in the school of thought, but largely drawn from the Dionysian view, which is more Neoplatonic in its view. So the view of theosis that I see in the New Testament.
Notice also he doesn't describe what is Neoplatonic. I mean, Emil pointed this out. It's like a catchphrase, like a virtue signal almost. He never actually says what it is that's Neoplatonic about what he's reading or what he thinks our theology is.
Testament, as well as in the earlier church fathers, is more economic in terms of the focus is on the economic redemption that has been accomplished in the incarnation of Jesus.
Right. Again, go to any of our services. Read the Manaean. Go to our matins. Go to a vigil. Listen to what the services actually say. Don't just read Losky or some other secondary material.
What that does for our salvation. That doesn't mean there's no experiential aspect to that or effect of that, but in its core, it is an economic reality, something that Jesus did and earned for us. And the third is the doctrine of justification. I'm Lutheran, so very clearly I'm going to go back to the Doctrine of Justification. In my video on 5 reasons why I'm not Roman Catholic, I did the same thing there as well. So this is really going to be a core issue that keeps me Lutheran instead of my going either to Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, if I were to go one way or the other, it would be Eastern Orthodoxy without question. But nonetheless, there are still reasons why I'm not Eastern Orthodox, and justification is a large part of that. Because I do see in Scripture that there is this forensic language. Now, in a lot of Orthodoxy, and specifically I'm thinking of people like Losky, there is this antipathy toward anything that is Western. And I am indeed Western. I have Western ideas and Western concepts. I have a strong affinity for St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas and Martin Luther and those who are part of the Western tradition. Not that I don't also have an affinity for many in the Eastern tradition. I certainly do. But it's that antipathy toward anything Western that leads a lot of Orthodoxy away from any kind of forensic language. And to me, that's just clearly language in Paul. I don't think you can get around the fact that there is so much legal language surrounding justification, language of judgment, language of acquittal, language of guilt, condemnation, all of these things that are that is courtroom language. And you can look at various texts that delve into this more specifically, but that kind of courtroom language is really all over the place in the New Testament. Now, what I've always argued is that there is participationist language that the East does grab onto in the New Testament as well, but there's also forensic language. And to have a balanced soteriology, we need to grab onto both because they're both these biblical motifs. Now, it has been the case within Western Protestantism that there has been this emphasis on the forensic and judicial to the extent that there hasn't been this emphasis on the participationist. And I don't think that's good either. And I think if you look at the earlier fathers, you have both of these. So when you look at someone like St. Athanasius, his treatise on the incarnation, yeah, the East is going to focus on the kind of theosis language that shows up, which is certainly there and a big theme in that particular work. But there's also language of debt and a debt being repaid. He speaks about mankind as through the fall ending up in this debt that they owe God, and the debt is death, and that debt has to be paid. And in the cross, Jesus pays that debt of death to God. So you have this legal atonement language as well as this participation becoming God language in Athanasius.
Right. Okay. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Again, just a total caricature of orthodoxy. Yes, we do have atonement language. We do have these things. There's a fantastic quote. Emma left a fantastic quote about a year ago. I'm just going to post that quote at the bottom, because where there becomes a problem is separating out all of these things: justification, sanctification, being made righteous, as though they're individual steps. Instead of it being a one whole thing, right? Because Jesus comes and purifies human nature. Okay, and we participate in that purification, right? We can choose to participate or choose not to. We can say, no, I like the way that the world is now. I like the way that my life is now. I'm just going to continue doing this. Or we can say, no, I'm going to be obedient to what he did. I'm going to be obedient to the sacrifice on the cross, and I'm going to die to the world, right? What does he think death to the world is? It means death to ourselves and bearing the cross. That's what that means. And if we don't participate in that, just as St. Paul says, we are baptized, right? We participate in his death in the hope of participating in his resurrection. So I don't really get, like, we're part of it. There's no just, these are things happening to us, kind of monergistically, and we're just automatons, walking around. I do want to say, though, he does bring up theosis language, and he seems to really be saying that this is only an Eastern phenomenon. But I know he's going to bring up Orange, the Council of Orange, later. And so I thought, well, who was the president of Orange? St. Caesarius of Arles. And I happen to really love St. Caesarius of Arles. I did a lot of papers on him. A lot of my blog posts quote him, right? And so I remembered things that he had said that are without a doubt straight what we would consider Eastern or theosis, right? I'll just read this quote here. I entered a virginal womb to be born without destroying that virginity. I was placed in a manger and lay there covered with swaddling clothes, suffering the outrages of infancy and human pain to become like you, in order that I might make you like me. Where's Arles? Oh, that's right, it's in France. This is a Western father, 5th century. This is not an Eastern thing. Then I bore the blows and spittle of those who mocked me, and I drank vinegar mixed with gall. I was beaten with scourges, crowned with thorns, fastened to the cross, pierced with wounds, and died in agony, in order that you might be saved from death. Behold the imprints of the nails by which I hung affixed to the cross. Behold my side pierced with wounds. I took upon your sufferings that I might give you my glory. Again, John 17:21. What is his glory? It's himself. It's the divine nature. We become what Christ is. Christ is two natures, God and man. The saints are called Christians. Why? What does Christian mean? Little Christ, God and man. That's theosis. I took your death that you might live forever. I lay buried in the sepulchre so that you might reign in heaven. This is not an Eastern saint. Saint Caesarius of Arles, president of Orange too. I have St. Hilary of Arles as well. Just as God stepped out of his nature to become a partaker of our humanity, so we are called to step out of our nature to become partakers of his divinity. Theosis is not an Eastern thing, my friend. It's in the West. You just lost it.
And you can't tear those two things apart. So I would say that in the fathers, we have both of those. And when you look at someone like Johann Gerhard or these figures within the Lutheran tradition, even Martin Luther himself, who drew largely in some ways from the Eastern Fathers, and so did Martin Chemnitz heavily, especially in this Two Natures of Christ, that you have both of these motifs coming together. And so the problem with Eastern Orthodoxy there is this lack of justification, lack of legal, lack of any forensic categories at all, when those are really prominent in the New Testament as well as in the early church. And the fourth reason is just that I'm Augustinian. I'm Western. I believe that St. Augustine was basically right in a lot of the ways that he spoke about theology. And that means in terms of his De Trinitate, or his treatises on the Trinity, which is a very large book and complex one. And this is at the root of a lot of East-West debates in terms of the idea of the procession of the Spirit. So there's that. And that's a complex issue that I really can't unpack here. But I will say I am indebted to the Augustinian tradition in terms of understanding of all sorts of things. So the Trinity is one of those. And another one of those aspects that I'm very much indebted to St. Augustine on is his view of original sin. And within Eastern Orthodoxy, there is a lighter view of original sin. There is an emphasis on the freedom of the will or human synergy in conversion.
I'm going to pause it here. So again, another total caricature of Eastern Orthodoxy. And actually, it is a problem that plagues Eastern Orthodoxy in America. We get a lot of Calvinist converts who are more so fleeing from Calvinism than they are coming to Orthodoxy to embrace what Orthodoxy is. This idea, two things. One, I do want to touch on this quick thing before I forget. He says there's a synergy in the conversion. This is a big confusion. This is a huge confusion in what we mean by synergy. We are not Pelagians, okay? So God calls us, and then we can respond, but God's the one calling us. We are also not saved in conversion. There is a type of salvation. Baptism is a type of salvation in which we participate in the Lord's death, in the hope. That's the clear biblical word, in the hope of the resurrection. Okay? So this idea of, he kind of slid it in there, the synergy in the conversion. No. Synergy happens after we are converted. We are called, after we are called, right? We're not Pelagians. Okay? And again, this is, Orange 2 is not a problem. I wrote here, I have a comment written up here about Carthage 4:18. Carthage 4:18 dealing with Pelagianism. And it is ratified at the Seventh Ecumenical Council. So if he thinks, if he's talking to Eastern Orthodox, or he's reading some secondary scholarship and they're saying XYZ things about how we don't accept original sin or whatnot, I can't really blame him if he's getting these ideas from faulty sources. But on top of that, this idea that Orthodoxy does not believe in original sin. Dr. Cooper, do you not know that baptism in the Orthodox Church involves no less than 3 exorcisms? Why is that? And yes, even of babies. We exorcise babies. Why? St. Diodocus of Photiki talks about how prior to baptism, Satan indwells the catechumen. Satan is living inside all people until they are baptized. Why? Because they are of the world, and he is the ruler of the world. And only baptism cleanses this. There are 3 exorcisms prior to an initiate's baptism into the church. And this is echoed also by St. Gregory Palamas and St. Theophan the Recluse. So this idea that original sin is not part of the Eastern Church or is not as big, again, participate in our services. Read what our services say. Read the texts of our services. Don't read the secondary scholarship. I don't know where you're getting these ideas from. Original sin is the most emphatically part of our church. We exorcise the initiate 3 times because Satan is indwelling them. Okay, this is a big reason why baptism saves, right? It's also a big reason why Saint Dionysius the Areopagite says that catechumen are rank below the demoniacs, because the demoniacs in the church are in the church, but the catechumen have Satan as their leader. Satan is inside them. He is physically inside them. That is what our services say. That is what the baptism service says. So, I mean, maybe it is a fault of Orthodox in America not knowing this. Maybe they don't know it, or maybe they don't emphasize it enough, or maybe they want to emphasize something else. Again, I really do think that a lot of American converts from Protestantism to Eastern Orthodoxy are fleeing, rather than, they are more so fleeing their old tradition, more so than coming into Orthodoxy. But again, it's just a total caricature. We do not deny original sin. We do not deny that we are under the curse of the transgression, as St. John Chrysostom says. Even the Theotokos is under that. That's why she dies. That's why everyone dies. We all bear the punishment. That's why we all die. That's why even when Elijah comes back at the end, right before, he will die, because we all die. So, total caricature. And I'm sorry if I'm heated, but I just can't believe that this is what is thought that we believe.
And I simply don't see that in the New Testament.
Oh, I forgot. I did want to say, because he brought up Augustine and De Trinitate. Okay. And I wanted to bring up another Western saint. Okay, to go back to apophaticism. He says he follows the Augustinian method. He follows the Western concept of things. So let's see. This is Saint Hilaire Poitiers from his De Trinitate. For it seemed that the greatness of God so far surpassed the mental powers of his handiwork, that however far the limited mind of man might strain in the hazardous effort to define him, the gap was no lessened between the finite nature, which struggled, and the boundless infinity that lay beyond its ken, that is, beyond its understanding. That's it's apophaticism, Dr. Cooper. Right? So you say you're Western. I think there are plenty, and you'll notice every saint I am quoting is Western. Actually, every saint I'm quoting is French. That's interesting. I could have gone to Saint Peter Chrysologos. I could have gone to Saint Chromatius of Aquileia, Saint Gregory, the Great Pope of Rome, Saint Leo, the Great Pope of Rome. I could have gone to his letters, but I had these available, so I thought I would drop, pick these up. This is actually really also interesting. Saint Cesarus of Arles. I'll read this one as well. Again, President of Orange II. This also do we believe, in accordance with the Catholic faith, that after grace received through baptism, all the baptized are able and ought, with the aid and cooperation of Christ, to fulfill all duties needful for salvation, provided they are willing to labor faithfully. A Western saint talking about synergy. That is synergy. Saint Cesarus of Arles, President of Orange II. He's supposedly your Westerns, from your Western heritage. But that some men have been predestined to evil by divine power, we do not believe. But if there be those who are willing to believe so an evil thing, we say to them with all abhorrence, anathema. Looks like double predestination is wrong, and you don't believe that, Dr. Cooper. I know that you've talked against that. This also do we profess and believe to our soul's health, that in every good work it is not we who begin and are afterwards assisted by divine mercy, but that God himself, with no preceding merits on our part, first inspires within us faith and love. Again, this is against Pelagianism. Okay? But very clear synergistic language. After baptism, we are able to fulfill all duties needful for salvation, provided we are willing to labor. Very clear in a Western saint. Very, very clear language.
Testament. So I do take an Augustinian perspective on those issues. And I would kind of go to a more moderate Augustinianism, someone like St. Prosper of Aquitaine, the Council of Orange, more so than I would a strict Augustinianism like you find in someone like Thomas Gottschalk, or later within Calvinism, though Augustine and Calvinism are not, they're not equivalent. Augustine has disagreements with Calvinism, I think, as well. But in terms of a harder, a double predestinarian stance or things like that. But the Lutheran tradition in general has grabbed onto a more Prosperian, Prosper is quoted in the Augsburg Confession, but it's attributed to St. Ambrose. But without knowing it,
I do got to give you credit. I did not know before watching your video who St. Prosper of Aquitaine was. And now I'm rather interested to read through him. So thank you.
Prosper of Aquitaine is this really major figure because of a particular book that he wrote on the call of all nations on these issues. But so the doctrine of original sin that you find in St. Augustine, and the lack of human synergy in terms of conversion because of the state of sin as described in the New Testament, man's deadness in sin and all of the implications of that, the East really doesn't grab onto those. So the anthropology of the Eastern Church is one that I don't see in the New Testament. And it is there very prominently in a lot of the early fathers. I think we do have to grant that. It's very clear that that's the case. But you do have this other more Augustinian strand, and I think there are figures other than Augustine who do have this strong view of something like original sin.
To fulfill all duties needful for salvation, provided they are willing to labor faithfully.
Sin, you see it in St. Ambrose, who of course is going to have a major impact on St. Augustine. So I do follow the Western tradition in terms of the doctrine of original sin, because it is clearly taught, in my perspective, it is taught in the New Testament, and it is especially consistent with the theology outlined by St. Paul. So the fifth reason is the nature and the purpose and function of images in Eastern Orthodox theology. Now, I say this not as an iconoclast. I am not opposed to images. I have an icon on my wall. You can see a little tiny one there. I've got icons in front of me on this wall as well. So I use iconography. I think it is beneficial, but the way that it plays out in Eastern Orthodox spirituality, the sacramental nature of icons, and just the centrality of iconography in Eastern Orthodox spirituality is something that I just don't see in the earliest church fathers. So while I see iconography as useful, I don't see it as something that is necessary. And in Eastern Orthodox spirituality, it really has been elevated to the level of it being necessary. Now, the reason I say it doesn't really fit with the earliest Christians is that when you read the apologists, you read Justin Martyr, you read Axenagorus, you read others, they're pretty clear that there aren't really images in worship in the early church. Now, we do have some mosaics, we do have images showing up rather early, but the church as a whole certainly did not see images as so central in the worship.
Right. So I want to discuss kind of a big mischaracterization of the early church versus kind of what we would call the conciliar history, right? So prior to the Edict of Milan, the church is essentially underground, okay? And the church is writing in these little pockets, and they're writing for their little communities. This idea that they all knew about each other all the time and knew exactly what was going on in each other's community. They did know some things, but it was not like it was after the Edict of Milan. After the Edict of Milan, we come into the conciliar period. This is when we have the councils. This is when they ratify what Scripture was. Okay, so and the other heresies that came up with is Arianism, Nestorianism, etc., etc. This idea that they're all just going to be talking about all of these things at all times is just not. It's just simply not true. This is kind of a real weak point. I think I don't. I mean, I don't really have. He doesn't really go into why images are wrong. He seems to accept Dr. Cooper, you seem to accept that iconography is fine. You just don't like how much Eastern Orthodox use it, and that just seems to be like a subjective preference. But I can't. I just. I do have to talk about. I can't let this issue slip. The historical issue that the earliest church fathers are going to be absolutely addressing all the central things. I mean, if we read the Didache, it talks about the liturgy and the way that it is run, right? And so, and we go into the letters of. Do I have this book? Yeah, sorry. This book. This book is very, very good. Okay. I mean, you'll get the letters of Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Ignatius of Antioch. It has the Didache in it, right? And you read these. I mean, Justin Martyr and Irenaeus are very good. Do not get me wrong, but they're not the only early church fathers. Hippolytus of Rome, etc., etc. Right. So, really, I think coming towards the end of this video now, it's just granted he only did a 15-minute video, but it really is just lacking in any kind of real substance, and just is just an absolute caricature of from apophaticism versus cataphasism to even what apophaticism is itself, to Saint Dionysius, to not having enough concept of redemption when that is replete in our services and even in Dionysius himself, especially in St. Maximus Ambiguous 7, particularly in St. Gregory Palamas. And the reason I bring up those three is that Maximus and Palamas are continually quoting Dionysius. Dr. Cooper, I'm sorry, I just don't believe you've even read Dionysius. I don't think that you've read the primary texts. If you have, a gross misunderstanding. We have to be very, very careful about divine names, understanding that it is an unfolding of the names, knowing that yes, we name things about God based on the things that we participate with here, but that we have a direct participation with what comes after. Jesus is going to give us what no eye has seen and what no ear has heard. And we have direct participation with whatever that is. And that is beyond being. That is apophaticism. We cannot contemplate what that is. I don't know what it means to participate in something that no one has seen before or that no one has heard before. That's what that means. It's unknown, right? So, yeah. Anyway, I don't know. I thought that the comments below really didn't do justice. It was just a lot of it was insults, and again, a lot of Eastern Orthodox on the internet do not act particularly well. I am going to link Emil's quote on this comment on this video. I thought it was quite good, and I will link that at the bottom of this video. Anyway, Dr. Cooper, thank you for taking an interest in Eastern Orthodoxy. I hope that you seriously consider learning more and investigating more about the subject. Sure, I guess that's it. All right, God bless.